It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Iris Holzer. She's an assistant teaching professor in the Environmental Studies program at UC Santa Barbara. And prior to that, she did her PhD at UC Davis in the Soils and Biogeochemistry graduate group. And before that, she did her bachelor's in geology from Scripps College. So we didn't know each other personally before this talk, but I was very excited to invite Dr. Holzer because we share the same, well, not even quite graduate group, but we were in grad school in the same department, the land, air, and water resources. And this is something I tell all of you undergrads in my classes is once you share a major or an Aegis club, for example, that network never goes away, right? And there's always something strong there, and this is very much how it works here for grad school as well. So thank you, Dr. Holzer, for being here.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for the invitation to be here. It's really wonderful to be in Chico, especially at this time of year. It's beautiful, and I've really enjoyed getting to see a little bit of the city and the surrounding area over the past couple days. So I'm really excited to be here today and to give a talk that I hope will kind of connect across some of the varied perspectives that I know are present here in terms of geology, environmental science, soil science, and agriculture. So thank you all very much for having me. And today I will be talking about my research on enhanced rock weathering. And just to provide a little bit more background on kind of how I ended up here. So it was sort of a product of circumstance. I grew up in Missouri, played a lot outside, but didn't really have a clear vision for where my life was going in terms of science or college, certainly not graduate school. And in undergrad, I sort of stumbled into geology and soil science very much by accident. Had the opportunity to go out to the basin and range in my first year of college, which kind of really opened my horizons in terms of the possibilities of doing science outdoors. And okay, we'll hold our breath. Hopefully it stays connected. But yeah, so I ended up doing my undergraduate work in geology and sort of started gravitating towards soils as this kind of intersection between Earth surface processes and Earth science and some of these more human applications of thinking about rocks. I did my field camp in New Zealand and then came, after a brief stint with the USGS, came to UC Davis, where I did my PhD in soils and biogeochemistry, really thinking about applications of weathering in both a very applied context in terms of enhanced weathering, so thinking about carbon dioxide removal in agricultural systems, but then also thinking about weathering in natural landscapes and the release of rock-derived nitrogen in forests of northwestern California. So I'm not going to talk about that today, but just wanted to kind of highlight that I'm very interested in weathering connections across landscapes and systems. So now I just started in January. I just got through my first quarter. Really excited to be here on my spring break. I just submitted grades for Intro Soils, and I'm an assistant teaching professor at UC Santa Barbara in the Environmental Studies program, where I'm teaching soils classes and environmental chemistry classes. And here's my giant backhoe pit on campus, setting up a siphon. We've had a very wet winter on the Central Coast, so the soil pit has spent some time as a lake this winter. And then also learning a lot with students about the marine terrace soils on the Central Coast and many of the challenges with erosion and this kind of human coastal interface. These are, I had students in my class this quarter who were being sort of evacuated during lecture as these pretty unconsolidated marine terrace soils are facing a lot of erosion with the heavy winter storms we've been having. So that's sort of where I am now, but I'm continuing to think a lot about some of these questions that were a core part of my dissertation and enhanced rock weathering. And so this kind of theme of weathering is what I'm going to be talking about today. And I really, just to kind of set the stage and our framework, I think weathering is so incredible because it's so connected to so many biogeochemical processes that we see happening kind of at the terrestrial interface as we observe these processes of mineral transformations. And one of the things that I think is most incredible about weathering is that it's happening across such varied spatial and temporal scales. So we can think about weathering occurring at a planetary scale over billions of years, but we can also think about how weathering is occurring at landscape or watershed or soil profile or within an aggregate of soil or even down to the molecular mineral structure. And this is one of the things that I think has kept drawing me back into research questions related to weathering is the diversity of these spatial and temporal scales across which we can think about weathering. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of this very applied weathering concept, enhanced silicate weathering for carbon dioxide removal, starting with a little bit of a big picture overview on that, and then talking about two projects kind of at these intermediate scales, so thinking about enhanced weathering field trials in California, sort of spanning this boundary between landscape and soil profile scales, and then coming into thinking about a little bit smaller scale of a mesocosm controlled environment experiment, and then zooming back out to talk a little bit more big picture about what is our current collective understanding of enhanced weathering, and what are some of the big lingering unknowns and future directions for research in this area. So starting with this kind of big picture enhanced weathering primer, if we think about natural silicate weathering as a terrestrial process, so global CO2 consumption from natural terrestrial silicate weathering is about 0.5 gigaton of CO2 per year. So what does that actually mean in terms of numbers? That consumes about 1.3% of our annual CO2 emissions are consumed through natural silicate weathering processes. And these processes of silicate rocks reacting with carbon dioxide that's dissolved in water is one of our really important long-term forces for climate stabilization and for moving CO2 from the atmosphere into aqueous systems and eventually into carbonate in the oceans. And about a third of this weathering is due to the weathering of basalt. And so when we think about kind of what this process looks like on a landscape, when we have uplift, we have fresh mineral surfaces exposed at Earth's surface, and we have weathering via carbonic acid, so CO2 dissolved in water, or also via other acids. And these weathering reactions generate alkalinity and release cations that are exported into the surface water, as well as carbonate and bicarbonate ions. And we may also be forming secondary minerals through these weathering processes. And then some of that CO2 may re-exchange with the atmosphere, but eventually a lot of those cations generated via weathering and the carbonate and bicarbonate ions are exported to the ocean, where we eventually see precipitation of carbonate minerals. And so when we think a little bit about kind of what these reactions look like, we can think about CO2 dissolving into water, that CO2 reacting with water to form carbonic acid. And then we can think about some kind of weathering reaction where here we have a calcium silicate wollastonite reacting with that carbonic acid to form aqueous bicarbonate, silicic acid, and cations. And this is definitely very much the sort of the simplest way, total dissolution that this process can go. We can form all kinds of clay minerals, different secondary weathering products, and we can also have reaction with other acids rather than carbonic acid. We can have changes to these pools of bicarbonate as environmental conditions change, like pH or denitrification. But really these cations are this part of this process that's being conserved as we go downstream. And if the other environmental conditions are right, allow for continued storage of carbon as bicarbonate and carbonate. And when we think about kind of what the big picture controls are on weathering at the Earth's surface scale, we know from natural systems that the really core controls are the amount of water and how much time that water is in contact with the rock. And there are other really important factors like how much exposed surface area is there, our mineralogy, so thinking about mafic minerals weathering more rapidly than felsic ones, the pH or amount of acidity in our system, but we really know that water is a super important dominant control. And despite that, we do still see considerable weathering even in drier systems. We can think about just down the road here at Table Mountain, or this is in a piece of basalt up in the Warner Mountains in Modoc County, so in the Basin and Range. And here you can see a piece of vesicular basalt that actually has carbonate minerals forming within the vesicles because there's not enough water to kind of export those weathering products. So it's very much dependent on water, but is still, these reactions are still happening even in drier systems. And so when we think about enhanced weathering, this is a process that is proposing applying crushed silicate minerals to different Earth systems, but often agricultural systems, and basically trying to accelerate these weathering reactions by applying material with rapid weathering potential in an environment with plenty of water, and then allowing, hopefully, those reactions to proceed more rapidly, and then sort of connect back to this process of export to surface or groundwater, and potentially, eventually, the ocean. And enhanced weathering has been pretty widely proposed in agricultural systems, partly because agricultural lands are already fairly heavily managed. There's infrastructure and equipment for spreading of amendments, and there's already some existing discourse around soil carbon, though typically in an organic carbon context. However, we have really wide-ranging estimates for how much carbon removal potential from enhanced weathering is possible in agricultural systems. And partly this connects back to that kind of scale question of weathering that I started with, that we are thinking about enhanced weathering at kind of global modeling levels, but also at very small scale laboratory experiments. And there's really not a ton of data at this sort of intermediate scale from field studies. And really, we do need better modeling, but we also need more field studies to understand both carbon removal and carbon removal quantification in the field, but also to kind of agree on our measurement approaches that we are using as a community in the enhanced weathering field. Particularly, especially in the context of my research being very interested in what this looks like in sort of volatile or drier climates that might be at the margins of where accelerating these silicate weathering reactions might even be possible. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the context of some of my work in California field trials. And particularly this project looking at direct evidence for atmospheric carbon dioxide removal via enhanced weathering. Some of this work is published, and some of it is on my agenda for this summer. So this work is part of the Working Lands Innovation Center, which was a California-wide project housed out of UC Davis, and we have some additional sites. My sense of rhythm never that good. So this project is housed out of UC Davis, and we had sites across the state of California. This map just shows our 3 that were in annual cropping systems, and my work was primarily focused at our Campbell site in Davis. And then this is the location, one of the locations where some of our rock amendments came from in Ione, California, not too far from Davis. And at this site, we had a block design and had a range of other amendments that kind of the overall project team was looking at, including compost and biochar. But I primarily focused on, and I'm going to be talking about today, my work specifically looking at crushed rock amendments at our Davis site. And since I know especially there are some geologists in this crowd, so we applied a metabasalt across 3 years. However, the thing that stands out most strongly about this rock amendment is that it is not very mafic at all, and there are a lot of interbedded felsic facies in the area that is being mined for this material, so we actually end up with a lot of quartz, which is not very good for enhanced weathering at all, basically just adding sand to the field. So you can sort of think of us as amending the field with everything that's not the quartz. And then in 1 year, I also applied olivine, which has a very rapid weathering potential. It's ultra mafic. It actually is almost entirely olivine with a little bit of some serpentine minerals. But there are a lot of concerns around using olivine for enhanced weathering because of its high concentrations of trace metals like nickel and chromium. So we applied that in 1 year at a lower application rate. And so really, my kind of driving question is whether or not we could even detect evidence of enhanced weathering and carbon storage over a relatively short time period in this dry climate. And so I focused on, especially given the pH range of our system, using alkalinity measurements as kind of a proxy for carbon removal in soil water samples, and also looking a lot at moisture sensors and climate data to kind of help understand soil water conditions over this period. And so here's just a little bit of what that looked like in the field. So installing these lysimeters at the depth to which we were incorporating rocks so that I could sample water kind of in that upper 15 centimeter zone where the rock was incorporated. Here I am installing a electrical conductivity and volumetric water content sensor and setting a vacuum on a lysimeter. And this is what those lysimeters look like more or less in the field, is a porous ceramic cup that when a vacuum is drawn on that tube, is able to pull water from the surrounding soil into the sampler as long as the pressure is more negative inside the lysimeter than outside. And then titrating those samples for pH, alkalinity. And so I conducted this project over about 2 years, starting in, I guess, really almost 3 from the first application, but about 2 of lysimeter sampling, really right through the pandemic. It was amazing to have a field site right in our backyard during this time period. And sort of looking at alkalinity and soil pore water dynamics, both during the growing season, because this is an irrigated system, but also during the winter rainy months. And this just shows a little bit more of kind of what that setup looks like in the field with our moisture and electrical conductivity sensors, and then the lysimeters set up at multiple depths, so the depth of rock incorporation, and also the depth where we were drip irrigating this field, and then collecting those water samples and titrating those samples. And one thing that proved really challenging in the early stages of this project is that it's just the variable winter precipitation. The first winter of this experiment for me was during a really, really dry winter for us, the 2020 to 2021 winter. And it had very patchy, sporadic sampling until we got some more intensive rain later in the season. And the field kind of wet up enough to allow for continuous sampling. But something that we were really excited to see is that even with some of these sampling challenges over this really dry winter, we still observed about 2.5 to 3 times increase in bicarbonate alkalinity in our 15 centimeter lysimeters. So this is our treatment with both olivine and metabasalt. And this one with the metabasalt alone. And then we see sort of similar trends, but they showed up later in the season at that 30 centimeter depth, so sort of below the depth of rock incorporation. So we were really excited to see any kind of treatment effect in this really dry winter when sampling is so challenging. And this is equivalent to about 0.12 to 0.15 tons of CO2 removal per hectare over this winter season. And this is pretty comparable to other field studies, but as I'll show you near the end of the presentation, the estimates for what removal looks like from enhanced weathering studies are kind of all over the map right now. So this is kind of solidly within range, but there is a lot of variability. So I kind of continued this project over a couple years. So that's just that was the first winter season of data. And also looked at other factors like impacts on soil physical properties. So one thing we're really interested in is we're applying this amendment at 40 tons per hectare for several years in a row. Kind of what are some of those impacts on soil physical properties like aggregate stability or hydraulic conductivity, particularly given that we're adding also all of this quartz that's not, we don't expect to be weathering as some of the rest of the rock is breaking down. We also looked at this question of electrical conductivity as a weathering proxy. It particularly commercial enhanced weathering ventures, but many different groups are very interested in low cost, easy to measure ways to kind of approximate carbon removal. And there's been a lot of suggestion of bulk soil electrical conductivity measurements. I'll tell you right now, those are heavily dependent on soil moisture, and certainly in a very variable climate, that is not a good approach for trying to get information about what weathering looks like, but we were really excited to have this kind of long-term data set looking at that because it's being so widely proposed. We also looked at changes in organic and inorganic soil carbon, cation release, moisture dynamics, not all of which I have time to go into today. But I just wanted to highlight briefly, this is a project, this project on soil physical properties with these soil amendments is some work that was led by an undergraduate student that I worked with. And we are in the process of resubmitting a revised version of this manuscript. She was really outstanding and led this work looking at penetration resistance, aggregate stability, hydraulic conductivity, and field capacity measurements across all of our amendments, but one thing that really stood out kind of in this first couple years after these rock amendments were added was finding evidence of greater hydraulic conductivity and aggregate stability, which we're sort of still puzzling over a little bit what that means, and also what it might mean if we continue to have long-term monitoring of this system. But one thing that we're really hoping with this manuscript is just to highlight the need for monitoring of kind of broader soil and ecosystem impacts related to enhanced weathering, not just on the physical side, but certainly on this soil physical property side, because this is an area, there is virtually nothing published on this, and it's certainly critical that we are examining what these extremely high volume, repeated rock applications, how those are modifying our soils, our water systems, and our crops. So if we look at our alkalinity measurements over time across the full 2 years of the study, so there's some big blacked out periods here during a variety of sampling and instrumentation challenges related to partly just field management at this location when the field was really wet, or when we were planting, or had farm equipment in the field. We could not have instrumentation in the field. But one thing that really stands out across all treatments over the whole experiment is this really significant upward trend in alkalinity measurements overall. And what we believe this is connected to is the sort of turn up of irrigation across this whole experiment, and the relatively high alkalinity in our irrigation water, which is partly groundwater from the Davis area. And so in this kind of strange twist where we're trying to monitor for elevated alkalinity, one of the big ways in which we are increasing alkalinity in the system is by bringing up bicarbonate-rich groundwater to the surface of this field where it can re-exchange with the atmosphere. And so I have major questions about the overall carbon removal of this entire project, and I think that there are some really kind of interesting nuances raised related to the chemistry of irrigation waters, and particularly what enhanced weathering looks like in a drier system where we're not necessarily exporting these weathering products downstream, and maybe repumping groundwater for irrigation. So this is an interesting wrinkle in the project. And really, the water input, so this is showing our precipitation over the course of the experiment and our irrigation over the course of the experiment. And so 84% of the total water inputs to this system were from irrigation. And because of some quirks of timing of early rain in this 2021 season, we saw a huge amount of our precipitation occurred during periods when the field was not instrumented. And these are challenges that are not unique to our field project, and are one of the bigger issues in enhanced weathering work more broadly, is that it's really challenging to do continuous monitoring of these managed systems, and that has big implications for what our carbon removal estimates look like. So kind of over the whole course of this experiment, we were able to sort of coarsely estimate CO2 removal in this range of about 0.14 to 0.48 tons of CO2 per hectare per year in our rock amended treatments. But this number is probably low from missing some of that early season rain. And we have this sort of broader background problem of these upward trends in alkalinity that likely reflect changes in our irrigation and the high levels of alkalinity in our irrigation water. And a little bit of a bigger picture challenge with these enhanced weathering projects is that the idea is not for these ions and this alkalinity to stay at the field scale, but this field scale zone of measurement does not account for that downstream fate. And this is something that we'll come back to in a bit of a bigger picture context. But for me, two of the specific questions that I had coming out of this were kind of this direct linkage between impacts of moisture excess and limitation on enhanced weathering rates. So I was really interested that we were able to see evidence of weathering with just a small number of high intensity storms, and was very curious about this kind of what some of these moisture extremes might look like in terms of impacts on weathering rates, and also very interested in this interaction between enhanced weathering and plants, particularly when we're thinking about implementing these approaches in agricultural systems. And so this led to a mesocosm experiment that I did, looking at the role of water and plant regulation of enhanced olivine weathering in red clover mesocosm. So this work was conducted in a controlled environment facility at UC Davis, where I was able to manipulate temperature, humidity, light intensity, CO2, although I went with ambient conditions, and grew red clover in this in these sort of small scale pots set up to look at this question of how olivine enhanced weathering varies across an irrigation gradient with and without plants present. And what I really expected to see was that increased water would lead to increased weathering, kind of aligning with our broader understanding of how natural silicate weathering is controlled, and that we would see this show up in the water chemistry, in the leachate chemistry of this setup, and also that plant presence would lead to increased weathering compared to weathering without plants due to both root respiration and also release of organic acids and root exudates. And so I had this set up with 4 different watering levels, pots amended with a higher dose of olivine than we would typically use in the field at a very small particle size, and using this magnesium-rich end member, which was very high in both nickel and chromium, so also kind of interested in looking at what the impacts of these high trace metal concentrations were on the clover. So I ran this experiment across 3 months, measuring kind of a whole suite of parameters, which I'm not all going to discuss here, but really focused on evidence of weathering and carbon removal, and also on the impact of the olivine on plant growth and trace metal uptake. So kind of thinking about these enhanced weathering impacts beyond just the carbon removal measurements. And so what we found kind of up front was that water, as you might expect, was the primary control on plant growth, and we did not observe any effect of olivine. I thought that the plants might have a bad time with that much olivine, but they were relatively unfazed. But the water-stressed clover did accumulate much more iron, nickel, and chromium. And here you can see, so our lighter colors are the more water-stressed clover. And so we saw higher, greater fluxes of those trace elements per centimeter squared of those pots, even though there was much less biomass production overall in those low water pots. So much higher concentrations of those trace metals. And looking at our alkalinity fluxes kind of over the course of the whole experiment, again with those lighter colors being the lower watering levels, we observed significantly higher alkalinity in all of the olivine treatments with clover. And so the clover, I'm sorry, I should point out, is this on the panel on the right here. And what we found, interestingly, so all pots, even at the low watering levels, experienced these monthly leaching events. And we found that these leaching events were enough to drive higher fluxes even at the lower watering levels. And that lower alkalinity at the higher levels was, I believe, limited because of limited water contact time with the rock. So greater water volume, sort of reducing that contact between mineral surfaces and the water that was added, and just sort of flushing that system. And another thing that I observed was increased extractable magnesium with olivine additions, which you might expect. So we can see that the dashed line at the top is the starting soil plus olivine, and this green line at the bottom is just our unamended starting soil. And so this is showing that we get kind of this big boost of extractable magnesium just immediately with the introduction of the olivine to the soil. And then some of that magnesium is lost to leaching over the course of the experiment. You see these values at the experiment end, but that we still have much higher magnesium on, much higher exchangeable magnesium than the starting soil and the unamended soil at the end of the experiment. And this kind of represents capacity for continued carbon removal even without additional weathering. So we can think of our exchange complex cations, if we're bumping up those concentrations, that if those cations come off and are lost as leachate, that's increasing, that's a later increase in the alkalinity of those waters that could sort of have this delayed effect of later carbon removal. And so this is something that a lot of enhanced weathering researchers are very interested in, is not just what is the immediate change in leachate chemistry, but also what is kind of the future potential, or is there a lag in some of these systems in terms of when we might see some of that carbon removal. So one of the things that was really fun about this experiment is that we were able to generate a range of removal estimates using different approaches and kind of compare them, and also using these extractable magnesium numbers to kind of look at the capacity for continued carbon removal even without additional weathering. And so if we think about kind of what this looks like at this whole kind of potted mesocosm level, so with the additions of olivine, we saw this immediate boost in magnesium after the rock additions, and then also the release of additional magnesium via weathering. Then we were able to measure plant uptake of that olivine-derived magnesium, as well as magnesium lost via leaching, and our changes in cation and alkalinity measurements. While also looking at kind of where that how much of that magnesium is staying on the exchange complex in the soil, and might be able to, at a later date, contribute to some of these cations that are lost via leaching. And the one piece that I did not look at during this project, and I'm still really very much hoping to do with these soil samples, is look at secondary mineral formation of some oxides that we could have potentially formed on the short time scale that this experiment took place over, because we do have a bit of a missing magnesium pool that, with kind of all of these measurements, there's a piece missing in my mass balance, and so I'm really interested in looking at this and trying to kind of fill in that full picture. So some of the takeaways, I showed just a tiny snapshot kind of this overall project, but really it highlighted these very complex interactions between soil biological processes and also some of the hydrologic controls on weathering. And we saw interacting effects of the presence of clover and water availability on weathering rates. And I, again, did not show this data here, but we did not see impacts of olivine on plant growth or on microbial biomass. But we, again, did see these higher concentrations of iron, nickel, and chromium in the water-stressed clover. And pretty variable estimates of CO2 removal, including lower fluxes at these higher water levels, which I, again, believe to be related to that reduced rock contact time when you're kind of flushing, kind of pushing a lot more water through those mesocosms. And again, kind of consistent with what we saw in the field in terms of seeing evidence of enhanced weathering, even with kind of infrequent storm events and low overall precipitation, that we saw that the leaching events were enough to drive increased alkalinity and magnesium fluxes even at the lowest water levels. So I'm going to kind of take a step back and zoom out to think a little bit about how this work fits into our broader collective understanding of enhanced weathering at this point in time, including some of the big lingering unknowns in this area right now, and some of the future directions that research is going in enhanced weathering. So this is kind of a more complicated version of that figure we started with, of thinking about how enhanced weathering is interacting with and kind of fitting into these terrestrial silicate weathering processes. And sort of this zone of focus around the field that we are able to capture with our field trial measurements. So we can think about things like our amendment and its characteristics, kind of what acids might be driving that weathering, what plant cation uptake and export looks like, and then kind of what some of those weathering product releases in the field look like, interactions with the exchange complex, possible precipitation of carbonate minerals. But as we move downstream from this field zone of focus, we become less able to directly constrain what is happening to that carbon or those weathering products. And it is also true that the inorganic carbon is dynamic in these systems and is not just sort of moving as a parcel from the field scale out to sea, but is engaging in these equilibrium reactions kind of all along the way. And so there is a lot of discussion right now among the broader enhanced weathering community in terms of like how do we make sense of these different scales of process, and how do we make sense of what happens kind of downstream from maybe the scale where we are able to do direct measurement. And sort of further complicating this is that there are really diverse approaches to experimental design in enhanced weathering. We can think about a whole range of rock types, particle sizes, application rates, kind of upstream emissions associated with grinding and transport of the rock material. And we can also think about very different experimental scales of these studies, so field, mesocosm, lab, modeling. And then we, of course, have the environmental system conditions of the systems in which this is actually being implemented, cropping systems. And so there's a whole range of parameters that are impacting kind of our ability to make sense of what is going on at a larger scale. And additionally, specifically the approaches to carbon removal quantification, these also vary widely. So there's kind of this question of measuring weathering versus measuring carbon. And are we trying to measure weathering products or secondary mineral formation, or how much of the original rock amendment is still present in the soil, versus are we trying to measure soil carbon, dissolved inorganic carbon, changes in alkalinity, again, these questions of cations in solution or on the soil exchange complex. And then there's kind of a whole body of work right now focused on using geochemical mass balance approaches and looking at the proportions of immobile trace elements that are in some of these rock amendments. And this approach, I think, is very promising on the weathering quantification side, but has its own suite of challenges related partly to needing enough contrast between the mineralogy of the rock amendment that you're applying and the mineralogy of the surrounding soil where you've added that rock amendment. So there's kind of a suite of challenges related to kind of what quantification approach should we be using, and again, these questions of different timescales, how you're accounting for downstream leakage and losses, and also what sorts of impacts on yield, crop, soil properties are being investigated. And typically we see published results on this that are on the strongly positive side. And so I have been part of a couple different efforts to try to help make sense of this, including this project a couple years ago, looking at sort of assessing different methods for determining CO2 removal related to enhanced weathering and trying to kind of bridge some of these geologic and agronomic perspectives and analytical tools. And basically we made this sort of giant, hideous table. And I think everyone on this project ended a little bit feeling like we hadn't quite fully been able to tease apart kind of how to make sense of some of these different approaches. And so I had the opportunity to take sort of a second stab at some of this with Carbon Plan, which is a research nonprofit out of the Bay Area, doing some really cool open access science and kind of serving as a little bit of a check and a body, making sure that the climate science and carbon removal approaches that are out there are being conducted in the most rigorous way possible. And so for this project, we worked to kind of articulate some of this methodological uncertainty and also describe some of the variables that go into thinking about designing enhanced weathering experiments. And we designed this tool that if you're interested in enhanced weathering, it's designed to be very accessible. And basically you can open up any of these drop downs of all of these different parameters that you might be interested in measuring for enhanced weathering, and whether or not those measurements apply at the rock application stage, sort of measurements of initial weathering, field processes, watershed transport, or ocean storage, and just as a way to kind of explore this suite of parameters. And one thing that we attempted to do with this project was review existing protocols that are out there for enhanced weathering, measurement, removal, and verification of that carbon removal associated with enhanced weathering. And this ended up being a much smaller portion of this project than we anticipated, partly because of the limited number of protocols and some of the challenges and issues with these different protocols. But we basically applied that framework from the tool to look at how is the Puro protocol, for example, accounting for emissions and carbon removal associated with the rock application, initial weathering, downstream losses. And unfortunately, the enhanced weathering MRV protocols are not really at a stage where there are accepted standards by the community. And in some cases, these protocols are being developed sort of in-house, associated with a sort of commercial enhanced weathering approach. And this is another piece of work from Cropland that I did not work on, but I think is really outstanding. It's from January of this year, looking at does enhanced weathering work? We're still learning is the title of this piece. And they've compiled all recent enhanced weathering literature in this really cool interactive format. And one of the things that you can see in this figure is that estimates of carbon removal in tons of CO2 per hectare per year vary across approximately 4 orders of magnitude from none to very low to greater than 10 tons of CO2 per hectare per year, which is a huge span. And so I had measurements kind of in this range, but this I think really nicely highlights this huge, huge span of estimates of carbon removal estimates from enhanced weathering. And this is also coming alongside a really rapidly evolving commercial landscape where there are a number of groups, Lithos, Undo, Ion, InPlanet, and a number of others who are kind of already operating in the commercial space of enhanced weathering, even though we don't have really collective standards agreed upon for what robust carbon removal accounting looks like with enhanced weathering. But you know, you can go buy yourself a subscription, a monthly subscription for some number of tons of basalt to be applied to a field every month on your behalf and offset your cell phone electricity use or something. So this is very much moving forward. And so I think kind of with this in mind and how much financial interest there is in enhanced weathering, one of the big things that we need is more field research and more publicly available data. And also better process-based modeling. And so there are some big multi-million-dollar national efforts right now to develop enhanced weathering specific reactive transport models. And so that is one big area of focus because there is a degree, no matter how much field research we do, it is very difficult or impossible to account for kind of all of these downstream processes associated with enhanced weathering. So that's where some of that need for process-based modeling comes in. I feel very strongly that there needs to be a much greater emphasis on ecosystem effects and on crop, soil, water quality impacts associated with this. And this is an area that there is not a ton of literature on, and a lot of the early field studies have not focused very significantly on this, except perhaps to highlight yield increases in some cases. And we also really need some agreement on what, if any, robust MRV looks like for enhanced weathering, what robust carbon removal accounting looks like. So for me, in terms of next steps, I'm going to be continuing some of this small-scale work with students at UCSB in the field and in kind of mesocosm setups. And also hopefully later this summer helping to contribute to review of some larger scale efforts to develop community-based quantification standards that have some broader acceptance. And also working on some a little bit more local questions of weathering impacts on water quality and salinity management in the Central Valley, not just in the context of enhanced weathering. And with that, I know we're coming right up on the hour. I would like to thank the many wonderful collaborators who have made this work possible, and also funding from the California Strategic Growth Council and a number of other groups, as well as my collaborators at Cropland. And I'm super happy to take any questions that you all have, and thank you so much for being here.